Hello, today we'll be talking about the Elden Ring timeline. This is part 2 of the Elden Ring timeline. Just a fair warning, this part of the Elden Ring lore will take comprehensive knowledge of the last videos I have made. If you haven't watched those videos, I highly recommend you go back and rewatch them, because if you don't, you just won't know what the hell I'm talking about right now. But with that warning, let's continue. We left off with capping off Marika overthrowing the ruling god who was the vessel of the Elden Ring in Farum Azula's now I have to solidify that point and then continue. So the first thing we know from this incantation is, in the beginning everything was in the opposition to the Erd Tree, but through countless victories in war, it became the embodiment of order. Now we know everything was in opposition to the Erd Tree. We also learned from my past videos that the Erd Tree actually came from the Crucible, or was the Crucible, but it came by removing destined death and imprinting the rune of the Golden Order within the Elden Ring, which changed the Crucible into the Erd Tree. Now, why this particular item description is so interesting is because it implies that the Erd Tree forces, even from the beginning, had military force enough to win countless victories in war. Now, many people speculate that the Erd Tree and Marika just were a ragtag group of guys just hanging around, and one day the Greater will decide, hey, Marika, become, I don't know, God. And somehow Marika mustered up an army, even though everything was in the opposition to the Erd Tree, and defeated everyone. Now, how does that make sense? Now, it doesn't make sense, right? The only way this makes sense is if Marika, before becoming a god and become the vessel of the Elden Ring, and basically creating the Erd Tree, had substantial military force behind her. Now, how would this happen? In the last video, again, we discussed that Marika may have been the offspring of the unknown god who was the vessel of the Elden Ring and consort to Placidusax, who was Elden Lord. We also learn that the Glowmite Queen was also supposed to be Empyrean during Marika's time, considering Guruk directly confronted the Glowmite Queen herself and defeated her. Now, we learn that the Glowmite Queen herself created the Godskin Apostles, also from the Godskin Talisman, and this is also backing my claim that the Empyreans needed, during Marika's time of course, needed substantial military backing for a reason, and this reason is obviously to become the vessel of the Elden Ring and to rule the lands between. Now, since Marika was chosen as an Empyrean, she fled the current god, maybe with Guruk's help. It doesn't really matter. We just learned that she was able to do it. Why? Because in Placidusax's remembrance, as we saw from the last video again, she was able to, from Placidus' remembrance, we learned that his god was actually fled. And fled meaning a force or someone actually made them flee. Now, people speculate the Greater Will got angry at the god and just fled it, but let's be honest, the Greater Will is way more pissed at Marika than anyone else, but still respects her vocation and her position as a god, and doesn't just kick her out or just remove the Elden Ring from her. So that's not the case. So it had to be some other force. And I speculate it's Marika, considering it makes sense if Marika becomes Elden Lord and I'm not Elden Ring, I mean the god, and changes everything about the way of life that was established by this god in Placidusax. And it's understandable why everything would be against the Erdtree, because firstly, the Far Mazula forces and the dragons would be against Marika, obviously, because she just overthrew their god and their Elden Lord. And every single other force that was established, like for example the Deathbirds, which we found out in the last video, used the power of destined death, which comes from the Elden Ring. And if you watched the past video, you know what I'm talking about. Would be against her, and basically every other force established at the time would be against her. And with her substantial military backing, which she most probably had as an Empyrean and as a demigod at the time, we also learned the reason how she actually won. She had the power of the Elden Ring and her husband Godfrey at her side. Now, we need to clear up a lot of misconceptions that surround the forces against Marika, their motivations, and their alignment. Firstly, the fire giants. Now, you have no idea how many videos out there say that the fire giants serve a different outer god than the Greater Will, or the Deathbirds serve a different outer god than the Greater Will. To this, I say, what evidence do you have? We learned that despite the Greater Will's obvious wish for death to be a part of life and the Elden Ring, Marika removed it, thus defying the Greater Will. The Erdtree and the Golden Order aren't derivative of the Greater Will, and maybe in some ways against it. And people associate the Golden Order and the Erdtree with the Greater Will directly, while it is they have a connection. It is not a complete alignment in goals and factions. In fact, Marika, it may not be aligned or subservient to the Greater Will's wishes at all, as I'll discuss later in later points of this video. But the fire giants in particular, I think, are not actually aligned with a different outer god. Firstly, it's never stated that they're aligned with a different outer god. It is just stated that they got their power from a fell god. A fell god is not an outer god, as we learn from many different sources. For example, outer gods are formless. They're conceptual. Like, for example, the Blood Mother. Not the Blood Mother, I mean the Mother of Truth, and the outer god that Mog actually worships. We also, the god of Rot, the outer god of Rot. we also learn that there was a god of Rot, which from the scorpion dagger, and that there's an outer god who has no form. So outer gods and gods are not the same, and gods themselves can be derived from an outer god. So why do people think that they serve a different outer god than the Greater Will? I'll tell you why. Because they think, since the Golden Order and the Erd Tree followers hate fire and see it as a sin, they think that the Greater Will sees fire and everything derived from fire as a sin. Again, as we discussed in our past videos, this is not the case directly. The Erd Tree followers and the Golden Order fundamentalists hate fire because it is derived from destined death. Destined death takes the form of fire and scorches the body and the soul of whoever it touches. And since the Golden Order removed destined death and imprinted their own rune into the Elden Ring, they hate fire because fire is derived from the rune of death. How do we learn this? The mending rune of death we get from Fia says it was originally in the Elden Ring and it was removed from the Elden Ring by the Golden Order. We also see this brand used by the Deathbirds who use Ghost Flame when they use their sorceries. This is the half wheel of the rune of death. And the rune of death comes from the Elden Ring, meaning the fire, the power of fire actually comes from the Elden Ring. I have more supporting evidence for this. For example, Melina says that one who walks alongside flame shall one day meet the path of destined death. And what puts us on the path of destined death? It's the fire of the fire giants, right? And from what we see, when the fire of the fire giants burns the Erd Tree, it is not enough to burn through the thorns. But when we unleash the rune of death itself, the fire that was on the Erd Tree from the fire giants gets stronger and actually burns through, meaning the giant fire is actually linked to the rune of death. And this also happens when we do the frenzied flame version of the same thing. The fire giant's fire actually leads us to the rune of death and death on its own, right? So the fire giant's flame is derived from destined death, because unleashing destined death increases its potency, and also they're connected to each other. So I think that the Fell God is just like the twin birds, who are also said to be envoys of an outer god, but I discussed that in our last video, so let's not get into it. I think the forces Marika actually fought against weren't against the Greater Will, they were against her in particular, and the Golden Order, and the Erd Tree that she established. So when she fought against the fire giants, most presumably the Deathbirds, but the Deathbirds would have been pretty useless by then because the power of the Rune of Death was sealed. The fire giants actually were on the side of the past ruler Falmarzula just by proxy of evidence that we see, because their power derives from the Elden Ring and the Rune of Death inside of it. Now that we've discussed this, we need to discuss the second point in the timeline that we established from the first one. The first point in the timeline was that Marika becomes God of the current order, becomes the vessel of the Elden Ring, and hoists her forces against the current ruling forces that were established, and enhances them with the Elden Ring. The second thing we learn is the burning of the Earth Tree, which is the first cardinal sin. And I think the fire giants committed this cardinal sin, and this is where the timeline needs to be entirely established. It's a little wonky. So the first cardinal sin was that the fire giants burned the Earth Tree, and then Godfrey and Marika and her forces defeated the fire giants and established the Age of Plenty. The Age of Plenty came to a close after Marika shattered the Elden Ring, but the Age of Plenty was during Marika's time, as we can read from here. The divine acts in itself as a sacred invocation, gradually restoring the carrier's HP. So, Greater Painted Shield, a divine scene. The recipients have a blessed tear from the Earth Tree, an item that looks back fondly at the Age of Plenty. The Age of Plenty is when the Earth Tree produced sap that was basically expelling the powers of the Crucible, because we read from the Amber Talismans that it has ancient residual powers, which is associated with the Crucible. And here we can read, it was once thought the blessed sap of the Earth Tree would drip from its boughs forever, but that Age of Plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time the Earth Tree became more an object of faith. So after the Earth Tree actually expelled all of this sap, and which later became amber, it became an object of faith. This is faith. This is the second point in the timeline that we need to discuss. The first is Marika becoming God. Second is the Age of the defeating of the forces against her and the Earth Tree, and her becoming the dominant force in the lands between. And the third is the Age of Plenty, which then swiftly came to a close. And now we need to get to the timeline that is closest to the current timeline. And here is where things get wonky, because there's no truly concrete way to actually establish what happened consecutively, but I've tried my best. So I'll walk you through it. So after the Age of Plenty, I think that the ancient dragons attacked, and also after the ancient dragons attacked, Godfrey was exiled, because Godfrey was Marika's husband at the time, and Godwyn was their child. And we see that Godwyn was the dominant force in the fight against the ancient dragons, which would have had to happen after the Age of Plenty, and after the Age of Plenty and the attack of the dragons, Godfrey would have eliminated all of the enemies, including the Stormlord, and basically become the dominant force, helping Marika to become the only dominant force in the lands between. After this, Godfrey was exiled, as we learned, because the color in his eyes actually faded, and so his forces were all exiled by America. Some theorists say that he was exiled by America herself, by America removing the golden hue from his eyes, but this is unsupported by evidence, and I think Godfrey lost his hue and guidance because there were no more actual enemies to fight, and he was still a warrior at heart. And after Godfrey's exile and the Tarnished and the creation of the Tarnished, we learned that Radagon, who was the consort to Rennala, left Rennala to become the consort of America. Now, we move on to the worst and the most complicated point to discuss, and that is Radagon, America, and how they work. And when did Radagon actually exist? And it's very complicated, right? So we have to start by doing this. We need to make a couple of correlations from multiple dialogues which support that Radagon was with Marika as long as we have known Marika, basically. And this is why. So Enya says the creation of the Golden Order began by removing and sealing destined death. We learn that after Marika became the vessel, or after Gorak defeated the Glomite Queen, not after, I mean after the sealing of destined death, Gorak defeated the Glomite Queen. The Golden Order is also derivative from Radagon, because we see that the Radagon source seal, on the Radagon source seal, there is a rune, and this same rune is imprinted into the Elden Ring. I've discussed this at length in my Erd Tree video. Go watch that if you want more information. So, if the Golden Order began by sealing destined death itself, and the Golden Order is derivative of Radagon and his seal and his rune, I think that Radagon was with Marika as long as we actually know Marika goes back, right? I think Radagon was with Marika for that long. Now, whether Marika and Radagon could separate and become one is a separate matter, and I think they could. And here's the reason why. Because Radagon was a husband to Rennala, while Marika was the wife to Godfrey. Now these two things were happening at once, so I think Marika and Radagon could separate. And after Godfrey's exile, they re-emerged as husband and wife, as weird as that may be. So I hope that clears up the conundrum of Radagon's existence. And by the time that they re-emerged, there are multiple demigod children which honestly lack relevance, bar none Rani, which has relevance, and I'll discuss her later on. And after they re-emerged and Radagon became Elden Lord, he had 3 demigod children, Rani, Radahn, and Rykard, while on Marika's side there was Godwyn, Morgoth, and Mog, and actually many other that we see in walking mausoleums. Maybe even a part of the golden lineage, maybe sons of Godfrey. We don't know, but we know that they're demigods who live in death. So it's less important, but the most important players I laid out. So after the union of Radagon and Marika, we get Mikola and Melania, who were both Empyreans, and here's where we get to our current Elden Ring timeline. We need to discuss the lives of each and every single child, and this can be hard. So instead of actually discussing the life of every single demigod, I will just discuss those who are directly relevant to the timeline. Like, I won't discuss how Mikola and Unalloyed Gold came to be. That is irrelevant to the major timeline which I've been talking about. I haven't been talking about the lives of each and every single character. I just established the major players. So one of the major players was actually Ranni. Ranni was also chosen as an Empyrean because she may have had an Empyrean body, as she says. Inherited that from his father, most probably, by coincidence or chance. And so she decided to enact a plan. Now, the full contents of this plan and relations of this plan is unknown, because there are many theories that can be made. We know two things. The first thing is that the Black Knife assassins were related to Marika herself. They were scions of the Eternal City, and Ranni stole Destined Death, slew her body, which is a complicated set of events, but I'll try to walk you through it. Marika and Ranni orchestrated demigods to pursue their own work. Why would she tell this to her children when the Golden Order would never permit such things? Because in the Golden Order there's only one god, and that is Marika. So she was planning this shadow told it to her own children. So everyone except Godwin, most likely, was aware of what was going to happen. So she didn't shatter the Elden out of grief. It was a pre-planned event. Why did she do this? Well, there was also Marika's dialogue that we get from Melina. So she says that she's going to explore the depths of the Golden Order. After the night of Black Night, the Shattering War began, and the demigods warred with each other over the shards of the Elden. Events come after that. So, put it is that I think Ranni is going to benefit from it.
because she wasn't able to prove God, which she didn't want to do. America was going to be able to tell the riddle wanted to be closer because she removed destiny from the Elden, directing this away here. The greater will wanted death to be a part of the order, but also make him an eternal leader. So if Ron replaced that, then we go against the roles of being eternal. Relic sword in our discussion, it says that the God that should have lived a life eternal. This means this is talking about America. So after that, the events of the day the Shattering Lord, basically. The sieges on Leyndell by Godfrey, firstly. Then the second siege, most likely the dawn, as we see that within the intro cinematic, and also we can read the sword memorial of the second defense of after that, basically what happens in game happens. This is an examination of the Elden timeline. So that happened within Elden. I just wanted to explore what happened before. The things that happened are not as clear. It took so long to make this because I needed to compile a lot of citations for my descriptions. The least interpreted.